first, we then have Andrew Pritchard, or Andy, if you'd like to go ahead and give us your presentation.
Absolutely. Gary and I are going to double team this presentation. So I think Gary is going to start off.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. I've got some short remarks. I don't know where all the group is knowledge-wise, so if we cover what's obvious, I'm sorry. So I'm Gary Kuntz. I'm the chairman of the East Columbia neighborhood, and you've met Andrew. He lives in the Cully neighborhood. He's the founder of No Jets Portland. A little bit of the history of this is that over the decades, the Guard tried to implement what they call the OCDA landing maneuver, but the Portland community have successfully resisted. The OCDA is an overhead continuous descent approach. It's an overhead brake with a landing procedure used by the military. The maneuver has the fighter jet circle over Portland residential neighborhoods twice in a route to the runway, and this creates two noise events over residential areas that historically had none or little. So in 2017, with virtually no notice, we in East Columbia were surprised to learn that a 6-month test over our neighborhood had just been scheduled. The community protested with petitions and letters, and later with testimony at the Citizen Noise Advisory Committee, that's the CNAC. We prevailed in convincing the advisory committee that the maneuver over our residential area was inappropriate. The Guard then rejected the CNAC recommendations and implemented the pattern over us. The community, not just my neighborhood, but a lot of neighborhoods, then gathered evidence and crafted a comprehensive letter to Governor Brown. You've all seen or had a chance to read the letter with its attachments. The letter's on East Columbia neighborhood letterhead, but it's not just an East Columbia letter. I had to give it a return address. We need something to be able to reference it by. So I put it on our letterhead, but it represents input from a lot of community members. And so that's my short little spiel. I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Gary. And to the esteemed members of the Rose City Park Neighborhood Association and Lieutenant Colonel and hey, Steve, good to see you again. Thank you for your service as guardians of the public's ears. Please know that, and this is the RCPNA, please know that you have the opportunity to improve the quality of life for thousands of Portlanders, and it wouldn't even take a dime out of RCPNA's budget. I'm Andrew Pritchard. I've lived in Cully for a while now, and as the founder and spokesperson for NoJetsPortland.com, I have sought to increase knowledge and awareness about the issue of OCDAs over our homes and schools. This is, amongst other things, a public health issue, and I'm convinced that if more people know what's going on and people could imagine their own neighborhood and schools underneath a new flight path, we could bring a stop to these industrial noise polluting practice maneuvers over civilian residential areas. Therefore, we're asking our colleagues at our CPNA to take action. Please endorse our dissertation-like letter from June 17 of 2019 to Governor Brown, or at least write a letter to the governor, which generally supports its findings and will serve as a community bulwark against expansion of the OCDA. The OCDA is a complicated, convoluted issue, and some people think that we oppose the Guard's activities or their fighter jets in general. And let me be clear, this is not the case. We support the Guard's mission, and we understand and appreciate the important work they do, as well as the unique fact that there's a military base at a major civilian airport. However, many Portlanders, including the neighborhoods of Cully, Concordia, East Columbia, Roseway, Sumner, Woodlawn, and Piedmont, specifically object to Orang's use of the OCDA over civilian residential areas. Today, RCPNA can strengthen the chorus of its neighbors and say no to a practice that fundamentally alters the soundscape and psychological landscape of our city. Portlanders have a decades-long track record of opposing the use of the OCDA because A, it's not appropriate to establish a new military flight path over historically unaffected areas, and B, it establishes an industrial practice in residential areas. It's the same reason you wouldn't open up a factory in the middle of Rose City Park. For decades, the Guard was mission and combat ready and practiced the OCDA elsewhere, and it can do so again. The Guard's actions speak louder than its words. It's pushed to expand the use of a maneuver that has been officially opposed by Portland City Council, state legislators, and multiple neighborhood associations of the impacted areas, belies its role as a good neighbor that says the right things. The Guard claims to care about public process and community feedback, but the historical record shows that at the end of the day, it blatantly ignored the desires of Portlanders, such as yourselves, and did whatever it felt like doing in spite of a lengthy public process. Who will keep the Guard in check? Incrementally, the Guard is flying the OCDA more frequently and over more people. For surrounding communities, it's death by 1,000 cuts. When does it stop? When is enough enough? By its own admission, the Guard's justifications for using the OCDA in Portland are its convenience and budgetary considerations. The Guard is compromising the peace and quality of life for thousands of Portlanders, primarily low income, in order to protect the peace and our quality of life and save on gas money. It doesn't make sense. So why does this matter? Noise pollution, it's real, and the World Health Organization agrees. And once again, this is not about regular airport noise. It's about this one maneuver, and that's it. At the Citizens Noise Advisory Committee, Portlanders testified that the noise pollution caused by the OCDA causes physical, mental, and psychological issues. It can trigger PTSD. People can't work from home or hear themselves think. In my home, the low-flying fighter jets shake floors, windows, and walls, and to induce the awful sensation of your chest cavity and skull vibrating. It shakes the sky. And once I realized that it would forever rattle my nervous system, I had to get involved. It feels terrible, and I know I'm not the only one who has lost a lot of sleep because of the OCDA. And now I'm gonna ask some of you if you remember how it was in 2017 in Rose City Park during the test period. Many of you may recall those jets flew over your neighborhood more often than normal, over Safeway and south of Sandy Boulevard. It could be that way again if you don't take minimal action. Put yourself in someone else's shoes just for a moment. Just imagine if the Oregon Department of Transportation built a highway overpass directly over your home and did so without your consent and without compensating you. How would you feel? What if the Oregon Air National Guard flew a brand new flight path over your home, a home that was nowhere near military flight paths when you chose to move there? What happens when the next generation of fighter jets, which have even louder noise signatures, come to PDX? Without consent and without compensation, you would feel violated, because your rights as a citizen are being abrogated in the interest of saving gas money or bureaucratic inertia. You would feel violated, as I do now, because the sovereignty of your home, your little slice of the American dream, is being sacrificed. The OCDA is an industrial practice that is incompatible with residential settings. Now imagine if National Guard ground troops, tanks, and jeeps routinely drilled through the streets of Rose City Park. No one would tolerate that because it would be considered to be an unacceptable industrial use for an area that is zoned residential. Though the technology of flight is seemingly miraculous, it is no less mundane. It is a failure of imagination of leaders to not see that the practice of these military maneuvers is unacceptable, whether through, on, or above civilian residential neighborhoods. Just because the OCDA occurs hundreds or thousands of feet above your head doesn't make it acceptable. Now's the time to address the evergreen issue of social equity. The OCDA usually does not occur over the wealthiest neighborhoods. The Cully neighborhood, which bears the brunt of the negative effects of the OCDA, is the most diverse neighborhood in the entire state. Many people in this lower income neighborhood don't have the means, knowledge, or even language skills to engage with the public process and stick up for themselves. Somehow the guy who runs the site of the Cully tire fire is somehow still in business, as an aside. The fact remains that the Orang will not put its commitments in writing, and we've asked them, and it currently reserves the right to escalate its use of the OCDA at any time and inflict more harm on Portlanders. Orang could once again renege on its commitments, or future base commanders without institutional knowledge of community sentiments could obliviously expand its use unless we bring it to a halt. Now the Guard says it will expand its use of a noise polluting maneuver. Is there any regulatory oversight for those who pollute? Marginalized communities are no less deserving of a noise pollutionless quality of life. Portlanders deserve to be treated equally, regardless of color, wealth, or class. RCPNA can support this cause by merely writing a letter. This is a social equity issue, a private property value issue, a public health issue, and most obviously, it's a quality of life issue. We thank you in advance for your help, and of course, we welcome questions and further discussion and can give our contact information to continue the dialogue after this. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Ed, you got us all muted.
There we go. Let me turn it over to Mac. Thank you very much, Andrew. And
Thank you,
Gary.
Andrew, and thank you to the RCPNA for allowing me to speak in front of you and on those cheery notes. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Mac Young. I am a fighter pilot with the 142nd Fighter Wing. A little bit about my own background and how I got to this position on your Zoom meeting here tonight. I graduated from the United States Air Force Academy in 2004. I spent 8 years flying fighters for the active duty. I flew a combination of the F-15, the Eagle that you guys see over the skies of Portland, as well as the F-22 Raptor, one of our newest 5th gen frontline fighters we've got. I was fortunate enough back in 2012 to join the Oregon Air National Guard, get hired here in Portland to transition back to the F-15. Since 2012, in those past 7 years, I've become an instructor pilot in the aircraft. I've gone to weapons school and graduated, and I'm currently our Chief of Standardization and Evaluation. So not only am I an instructor pilot in the F-15, but I'm also an evaluator pilot. So when we give our pilots check rides, I am one of the handful of individuals that are allowed to evaluate those members. So as the Chief of Stan Eval, as we call it, I make sure that our folks uphold the standards, that they adhere to the rules and the rules and the guidelines that we have to fly within. As far as being a Portlander, I've lived in Portland very happily for the past 7 years. I've met a wonderful lady since I've been there. I married her and made her my wife. I now have a 2-year-old son and another son on the way. We've lived, she's a Portland native. She's lived in Portland her entire life outside of going to college. She works here in the Portland area, and we've lived, and I've lived here for the past 7 years. Granted, that's probably the shortest amount of time of anybody here on the meeting, but I do enjoy Portland. I'm fortunate to have other opportunities to go serve elsewhere for my country, but it's Portland I choose to make my home because of the community that it is, and it's the town that we love. I'm coming to you tonight not from Portland, but from an undisclosed deployed location. Me and 200 of my favorite Oregonians are currently deployed, and I think we would all agree that there's never a good time to be deployed from your families. But during the time of a global pandemic is probably the worst of the 6 deployments I've been on, the worst time to be away from my family. And that's unfortunately the nature of the business that we are in. I'm very, Andrew, I understand the sensitivity that people have to noise. Of those 6 deployments, more than one of them I've spent living in a tent on an airfield at the end of a runway. And I understand how disruptive noise can be. And I could tell you and give you the decibels of what an OHCDA, what an overhead continuous descent approach flown correctly gives you versus what a standard military overhead approach is. And I could give you the decibel readings, and I could give you the science behind why we think what we're doing is more or less impactful for the community. But noise is something that is perception is king. Everybody perceives noise a little bit differently. So giving you that decibels is, if you think that that noise is sensitive to you, then it doesn't matter what that decibel reading is. That is a sensitive noise to you. And I understand that. I've been there, and it can be impactful. Knowing this, of the 13 years that I've been flying fighters in the United States Air Force, the deployments I've been on, the TDYs, I've flown fighters in almost every continent. And we do more at PDX to mitigate the noise impact that our jets have than anywhere else I have flown, hands down. And ultimately, what we do to mitigate that, the things that we do, whether it's a takeoff and mill power, or whether it's an overhead continuous descent approach where I'm in idle the entire time, majority of that risk that we accept to minimize that noise gets translated onto the 30-some pilots we have, and and we are willing to accept that risk in order to try and mitigate that noise and that impact that we have on the local community, because we are members of the community ourselves. Our wives and our families work in the community. Our part-time, our drill status members are members of the community. They're Portland firefighters. They're pair farmers up in Hood River. They're local police officers. We have pilots that are integrated within the community. Granted, there's only 30-some of us, so we probably don't all get the opportunity to know them, but they're Portlanders just like the rest of us. The overhead continuous descent approach, and hence the long drawn out name, or the OHCDA, is not a standard military overhead pattern. I'm operating out of an international airport here, and we do a normal overhead pattern. It is definitely different than the OHCDA. We have modified a standard overhead pattern to make it a little bit of a higher arrival altitude so that we can be in a continuous descent, which requires less power adage, which ultimately results in less noise. So we've taken a standard military procedure that we need to be, that we're required to be proficient in, and that we need to, for our own safety in a deployed combat environment, need to be proficient into. And we've modified it to get the training we require, but have the most minimal noise impact that we can afford within the confines and the limits of safety. The OHCDA does help spread the noise footprint from a standard straight in. If you are underneath that standard flight path, if you're on Hayden Island and you see that same flight path day after day after day, that is very tying on those people. Granted, we are trying to have an effort to spread some of that noise around. It might have a greater impact overall, but it affords some of the some mitigation to the people that are on a standard straight in arrival. Additionally, it helps overall lessen our noise footprint because it allows us to get to and from our airspace quicker. The faster that I can get that jet out of the airspace over water and back safely landed at Portland, the quicker that I can do that, the less noise that I'm going to make. That's just factual data. But like Andrew said, it does use less gas. And ultimately, that I'm not saying that that's a cost savings that I see or that any of us see, but in these times of constrained fiscal responsibility, especially for your government, for your tax money, I think it affords us to spend more of that time executing the tactics that makes us proficient at what our wartime tasking would be, and less time making noise over the Portland community because we can get safely recovered quicker. For just some statistics, some usage statistics, I've only been in this seat as your chief of standardization evaluation for about the past 6 months. So I've been keeping statistics since about since early November. So for the past 6 months, we've only used the OHCDA just about 25% of the time. So 3/4 of the time, we're doing a standard straight in arrival. And ultimately, a lot of the time, the deciding factor is we don't have the weather requirements that we need to do an OHCDA. I mean, we all live in Portland, especially this time of year. We know that we're going to be doing a weather arrival, which is a straight in approach. In the last 30 days, we've only done 2 of them. In the last 60 days, we've only done 19 of them. In the last 90 days, we've only done 52 of them. So just a few statistics. And like I said, I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to speak in front of you. And I'm very open to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Okay. Let me begin the questions. Do we want rebuttal first, or do we want to just ask questions? What do you think, Ed?
I think let's ask some questions. They may enhance the rebuttal opportunities to hear some questions initially. And then when we dry up the questions, we can go to rebuttal.
Okay. My question is, Mac, that apparently the continuous descent maneuver that was unmodified used to take place somewhere else. The question is, where did that take place and why did it move here?
Ma'am, I'm unaware of us doing another approach elsewhere. For, again, like, I've only been a part of the organization since 2012. And so to talk you through what it would require for us to go do that maneuver elsewhere is, so our normal training area, our airspace is off the coast of Oregon. It's a warning area that we call Whiskey 570 that we as the Oregon Air National Guard own. We'll share it with Boeing when they want to, Boeing test wants to use it. There's some UAS operators out of Tillamook that like to use it as well, but we are the main user of that. And it's off the coast of Oregon, and it allows us to execute the training that we require, going supersonic and flying at all altitudes that has zero impact to anybody else. So in order for us to go somewhere else and execute that procedure, it would require us to stop doing the air-to-air training that is our backbone, if you will, and start spending gas to go to another portion of Oregon. Obviously, we need a 8,000-foot runway, so nothing at Hillsboro is long enough. The next closest runway that might be usable would be Eugene or up to McCord up into Seattle. So now we're going to spend valuable gas and time that we could do training in the airspace to spend the 15 to 30 minutes to fly down to Eugene or to fly up to McCord. So it's that cost benefit analysis of, if I'm going to have to do that, now I'm not doing my primary job, which is air-to-air training. I'm going from point A to point B to practice one arrival instead of doing the air-to-air training that I would argue that the nation is asking me to do. And I think as an anecdotal piece of that is, when I joined the organization in 2012, we went to an exercise at a major international airport. It was in Honolulu, operating at a Honolulu International Airport. So a large international airport in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with not many other options to go to if something goes wrong. While we were there, the Honolulu Tower told us that we were one mistake away from losing our ability to access the overhead pattern. It's a very busy international airport, and unfortunately, our guys were not trained to execute an overhead approach and had not done it with enough currency and recency that the Honolulu Tower was going to take that opportunity away from us because we couldn't do it. And so while that might have been an opportunity in the past, I would argue that method did not provide the necessary adequacy of training that we require, if that makes sense.
Let me ask a second question. The issue is that this is taking place over a residential area. Is there a industrial area or a farm area nearby that you could use instead of right over the residence?
Unfortunately, not that I'm aware of. There's always been talk of, and Andrew and Gary, I'm sure you guys are aware of, and you probably tell me, like, Mac, why don't you just use the north runway, and then the noise goes out over the Columbia River, and the salmon are usually a lot less likely to be disturbed by the noise than the homes on the south side of the runway. And the main driver for that is the north runway doesn't have cables. So we don't require arresting gear every time we land like the Navy. That's not how we stop the aircraft. But when we have emergencies, there are certain hydraulic, certain issues that we'll have with either the landing gear or the aircraft itself that necessitate us to take an approach-in cable, or should I land and not have and my brakes just suddenly malfunction, I require a departure-in cable. So our rules and regulations are written such that it requires several levels of approval above not just me or my squadron commander, but if I want to try and land on a runway without cables, it requires an approval process because of the amount of risk that it entails.
Does the maneuver entail the landing of the machine as well? Or is it just a maneuver and then you come back and land? Could you not do that, 10 minutes out from the urban area? One of the issues that you have in Oregon is that we do have an urban growth boundary, and that compacts the residential area a little bit more densely than you would anywhere else in the nation. So therein, you do make a big impact on those residences that you do fly over.
Good question. I mean, so I just told you that I had training airspace out over the water. Like, Mac, why don't you go use that where you just told me that you're not affecting anybody? Unfortunately, the arrival and the landing, and ultimately the point of coming up initial and the standard military initial is because you can get more aircraft on the ground in a quicker amount of time than through any other arrival method. Additionally, you're spending less time in low altitude environment, which is where you are going to be at a higher risk to a man-pad, a more man-portable air defense system, some kind of shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. So that is kind of the training impetus that of why we require executing this, and it's a visual maneuver. So out over the water where I don't have a runway to get lined up with, I don't have a runway to kind of descend and spiral towards, I can't get that same training. And ultimately, to answer your question, the arrival ends with us landing, and so that is, it's not just I show up at a point, I do a 360-degree spiral. I show up over the end of a runway, I do a spiral in relation to the threshold of that runway because that's where I want to touch down. The closer to the edge of that threshold of that runway that I can put my two main gears, the more landing room I have in front of me, which gives me the more space to stop, which is the safest that I can be. So I'm flying in relation to that piece of that edge of concrete on the ground, which I just can't do without a runway there.
Okay, thank you.
So on the materials that were provided to us, there was a photograph, and it showed four quadrants with various patterns, 2 out over the river and the 2 over the neighborhoods. Based on what you just related, what is preventing utilizing the open space is the lack of cables on the north runway.
Yes,
If
sir.
it was approved, and I understand there's a number of levels to get approval and then of course funding, but were those cables to be approved and constructed, conceivably then you could move all of your OCDA exercises out over the river, north runway, since you could, the wind patterns, you could go to from the west or the east, either way. So that seems to be a bottleneck. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say it is at initial glance, it seems like an easy kill because I go, well, if that's the only thing that's stopping me from using the north runway, then why don't we install cables on the north runway? And
Right.
but it is not only is it a significant expense so the cables that you require at an international runway, because non-military folks are using it, we call back 12, but they raise and lower. So the tower controllers and PDX, when they know that we're about to either take off or land, they hit a button and they raise and lower those cables. So there's plenty of moving mechanical parts. The cables also have to be certified every so often. In order to install one, it requires cutting through the runway to build that channel. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can only imagine the millions of dollars that it would cost to modify the north runway. But that is an option.
Go ahead, Andrew.
If I may interject,
you have some data on this?
Yeah, actually, and this actually cuts to the crux of part of our argument, which is whether it's using cables on the north runway or having the convenience of flying a shorter distance to practice this maneuver, as opposed to where it was practiced in the past, which was over at bases that were over or nearby less densely populated areas, such as Klamath Falls and McCord, and places that were specifically military bases, where no one's going to complain about that sound because that's a military base. That's to be expected. The part of the crux of the argument that we make, and it's in the letter and in our presentation tonight, is that it's saving, it's cost effective and convenient, but in that cost benefit analysis, where does the peace and quality of life of this certain segment of the population come in? And we're saying, if this was happening over Laurelhurst or Sellwood, someone in that neighborhood would be on the phone, and 5 minutes later, this would be over, it'd be a done deal. That this component of social equity is important, And as a matter of fact, we actually met with Colonel Sittler, who is the base commander of the 142nd Air Wing. We had Gary and I had a sit down with him, and we discussed the idea of the cables with him. And setting all the technical jargon and aspects aside, and I understand, and probably going through layers of bureaucracy, I can only imagine how challenging that is with the military and the FAA and everything else. It comes down to money, and so decision makers are basically making this decision to cause psychological, mental, and physical health issues because it saves some money. And I'm just saying that should be factored into the cost benefit analysis. And that's where that's why we're here tonight, to say that's not okay. And also it was done elsewhere in the past. It can be done so again. And with regard to needing to do all the things that you need to do to be ready, of course, that's absolutely necessary. We don't contest that. But to say that the Oregon Air Guard has to perform the OCDA at PDX, otherwise it won't be ready, is to say that the Oregon Air Guard wasn't battle ready for the duration of the Cold War when they performed this maneuver elsewhere. Like, of course it can be done because it was done before and it can be done again. Thank you.
I have a question. And probably should direct it at Steve as the public relations guy, since he probably has more history to the background of this issue. So just so I'm clear, if we accept that this maneuver is necessary for preparedness for the Air Guard, is it true that this maneuver was performed at other airports in the past before it came to Portland?
Yeah, I'm not aware of that as well. So actually, Andrew, where did you get that part of info from? I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just kind of curious so I can track that.
I'm trying to think from all my research.
I think they were
Possibly.
using Kingsley.
Actually, some of that would have come from our meeting with Colonel Sittler. I don't have the notes from that meeting in front of me, but in terms of discussing that history, sometimes McCord up near Seattle, which was referenced earlier. So they used to practice this maneuver elsewhere. And then at a certain point, because of the aforementioned, it shaves off 15 to 30 minutes of fly time. That's what it comes down to.
Okay, I believe Mac has his hand up.
Just
Gary
to,
was
again,
first.
I don't have the history prior to 2012. I have a feeling that when you think because it wasn't happening at Portland, it was getting done elsewhere. I honestly think it just wasn't getting done. Reference the discussion of almost getting it taken away from us in Hawaii. Just to put some numbers to the thoughts of, well, we could go down and do it at Klamath Falls, which again, a big runway, long enough runway with cables because they have F-15s down there as well. Klamath Falls is 208 miles away from Portland. To frame that nautical miles, it is 40 miles from Portland to get to our Whiskey 570, our overwater airspace. So now you're going to take something that's 40 miles away, and you're going to make me go to my airspace to do some training, and then go another 200 miles away in the opposite direction. McCord a little bit closer, but it's still 100 miles. So when I go to and from my airspace, there's 80 miles in one day. If you want me to go up to McCord at the same time, now instead of transiting 80 miles, I've got to go 280 miles because it's 100 miles up there and 100 miles back. And now all I'm doing all day is going from point to point, and I'm a transport aircraft at that point. I'm not actually doing any air-to-air training. I'm just flying from point A to point B, not really accomplishing the goal. Like, because the goal of an air-to-air fighter is not to do an overhead approach. That is something we do to safely get recovered. The goal is for us to train in an air-to-air environment where I need to be able to go supersonic. I need airspace that I can go from the surface up to at least 50,000 feet. I've got to have an airspace where there's not anybody else flying through it, where I have the ability to practice employing ordnance against an outnumbered threat and adversary. And so when I'm spending my time driving to and from different airfields to practice one overhead maneuver, you're defeating the purpose in my mind of what we're trying to accomplish.
Well,
Okay.
you know, I can see that it's more efficient. I have another question for Steve. What was the process where the recommendation of the City of Portland and the Citizens Advisory Committee was discarded and the decision was made to proceed with the maneuver at Portland at PDX?
I'll have to get you some background info on that. From my understanding is that we did accept some of their terms. But again, I'm gonna have to get back with you the details for that. Maybe Colonel Young, do you have anything about that?
There were some of the terms, and again, I don't have that in front of me of what all of the recommendations were, but we did try and go in line with as many of their recommendations as we could. We're trying not to do it on weekends outside of our drill weekend, which is one of the only opportunities that our drill status, our pair farmers, our firefighters get the opportunity to fly. We're not doing it after 5 p.m. because again, that is family time, and that's time that we're trying to minimize that noise impact to all of the community. So there were numerous of the recommendations that we did accept, but I don't have the exact list in front of me. I'm sorry.
So who made that decision? Or what was the process that decision was made by Air Guard?
Stephen, do you want to take that? You might have better knowledge.
Yeah, I don't have perfect knowledge because I wasn't at that meeting. From what I understand, Colonel Duke Pirak, one of our former wing commanders, is the one that went to the CNAC to let the public know what we were accepting.
So it's a combination between the wing commander and the Noise Advisory Council coming to an agreement and a conclusion.
May I interject?
Okay, Gary, you've had your hand up for a while. Let's go ahead with that. And then we need to close the discussion and then.
I have a question that I've been waiting to ask.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
who's
put your hand.
Gary? Let Gary go, Terry. He's been
That's fine.
Thanks,
quite a
Terry.
while.
So the process seemed to be that Phil Stenstrom, noise management manager at PDX, went and had a discussion with someone at the Air Guard. No notes or memorandum of understanding were released to us. There was just this discussion behind the scenes to me. The Guard said, oh, we'll accept some of these recommendations. They accepted use of the North runways. The Guard had asked for 7 days a week. The CNAC said, no, how about 5 days a week, except one drill weekend a month? The Guard accepted that. The Guard requested sunrise to sunset. The CNAC said, no, how about 9 to 5 or something like that? And the Guard says, okay, yeah, we'll accept that one also. So what they accepted wasn't very limiting. And what they asked for, I thought they were asking for the moon and stars so they could accept quite a bit less. And I want to point out that all the visiting squadrons, F-15s, 16s, 35s, 18s, they land safely on the North runway. You guys are using the North runway right now because the South runway is closed. Safety is always kind of a fuzzy thing. We want to be the safest we possibly can, but everything we do is optimized. The safest thing for flying would be to never get off the ground or fold your wheels up. That doesn't make any sense. The safest thing in driving your car would be to not do it. That doesn't make any sense. I want people to be safe, but at what price? Then the Guard.
Let's have Terry speak, please.
Thank you.
Okay, I certainly understand the readiness that the Guard has to have for this, given our pandemic, and it seems like a lot of places weren't ready. You can comment on that if you'd like, but my question is, we're talking about noise pollution, but if you have to fly several hundred miles to do your maneuvers, not only are you using gas, but you're adding pollution to the air. And the air travel, be it fighter jet or commercial or whatever, adds a lot of bad quality to the air. So how, I guess, is there a balance here that maybe somebody can talk to me about? Mac,
Yeah.
maybe you?
Terry, I agree. Like that, not only is it pollution because you're flying now, instead of just going off the coast, we're going from one, say, take McCord, for instance. We're going from one major metropolitan area in Portland to another major metropolitan area in Seattle. And now we're just passing the buck. If we go down to Klamath Falls, same thing. We're just passing the buck from Portland to Klamath Falls to that area down there. And so we are trying to find a balance. What is the best for all of us? And so ultimately, that's why when I was Tamara, when you said that Mac was here for being in favor of the OHCDA, and I would argue I'm not here because I'm in favor of it. I just think that it's the best for all of us. Does it impact some people? Yes. Does it impact all of us? Some more than others. But I ultimately think that it is that right now it's that happy medium. It's that we're trying to be safe with our aircraft and our pilots that fly it. We're trying to mitigate the noise as best we can within the boundaries of safety. And we're trying to minimize the usage as much as we can. I mean, when the south runway is closed, yeah, we'll gladly use the north runway because I have no other options. All I have is the north runway. And so we're trying to hit that balance. We're always open to ideas. If there is another safer, economical alternative, then I know Colonel Sittler would be more than happy to execute that. But we haven't found as best as we can find. We've put a lot of brain power behind how do we minimize the noise of this procedure and how do we balance safety training and the requirements that our nation is asking us. And ultimately, I think from all of the data I've seen, the OHCDA is that happy medium, but unfortunately you'll never make everybody happy.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.